everyone. Welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations. This is a weekly broadcast put on by SPED Homeschool, which is a nonprofit that empowers families to teach children with specialized educational needs at home. And we are starting off a new year with a new monthly theme, which we do a monthly theme every month. And this month we're focusing on teaching methodologies. And tonight I'm super excited because we're going to be talking about unschooling. It's something that I told our guest kind of creeped up on me, and I'm so glad that it did. And so tonight we have the privilege of having Dr. Peter Gray with us. And I just want to welcome you, Peter, and thank you for just taking time to share with our audience and just the wealth of information you have to share. And I know we can't even begin to cover it in an hour, but I'm excited that you're able to share a little bit and just encourage our audience to maybe a teaching methodology that they have been scared of or didn't think might work for their child. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Very happy to be here.
Yeah. Just a second, I gotta pull that off. So I'm just going to read a quick introduction, and then also I want to remind our audience, if you're watching, that you can interact with us live. And if you have comments or questions, you can put those in the feed either on YouTube or on Facebook, and we'll see those and be able to incorporate those into our conversation. So Dr. Peter Gray is a research professor of psychology at Boston College who has conducted and published research in neuroendocrinology, developmental psychology, anthropology, and education. His recent research focuses on the roles in human evolution and how children educate themselves through play and exploration when they are free to do so. He's expanded on these in his book, Free to Learn, which is an awesome book. I'd have to highly recommend it. His research includes surveys of grown unschoolers and graduates of a school designed for self-directed education. He also authors a regular blog called Freedom to Learn for Psychology Today magazine. His research findings have led him to become an advocate for self-directed education, and he's a founding member and president of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. So much, and it's been a lifelong dedication of yours, and I'm just excited that you're able to share some of your wisdom with us tonight. So as we kind of get started, what is some, I guess you have probably lots of it, but just to kind of touch the tip of the iceberg on research-based information on learning and social development of children versus what happens in more of a structured school environment. So what are the differences? And I'll let you go with that.
Well, I'm really interested in the question of how children naturally learn. And the ways that children naturally learn are nothing like what we try to do in school. And in fact, schools actively repress the natural ways that children learn. I mean, children are designed to learn by exploring. They're just naturally curious about the world around them. They're designed to learn by playing. They play, curiosity. In one way to think about it is there's sort of two parts to education: acquiring knowledge and acquiring skills. Curiosity is the drive for knowledge. Children want to know what's going on around them. They want to understand it. They're constantly, as soon as a baby can move, you've got to baby-proof your house because the baby wants to get into everything, right? Why does the baby want to get into everything? Not to be naughty, but to understand it, to explore it, to figure it out. You can't stop children from learning, unless you lock them away in a closet. And so that's curiosity. And play. Children play, if they have ample time to play, they play at all the basic skills that human beings have to learn. So curiosity is how you acquire knowledge. Play is how you acquire skills. Well, of course, in school, curiosity cannot be the motive for learning because you've got 20 or 30 kids in a class. There's no possible way they're all going to be curious about the same thing at the same time, and the teacher has to be sure they're doing the same thing. And And so what you have in the classroom is not the questions of the kids that matter. And so the kids learn their questions don't count. What counts is the questions
Yeah.
of the curriculum, which
Mm.
9 times out of 10, even the teacher isn't all that interested in. This is just the question of the
Exactly.
curriculum. And so
Right.
children learn not to be curious. So we drive
Mm.
that natural tendency out of children in our schools. Similarly, if play occurs at all at school, it's recess. It's a break from learning. It's not regarded as learning. It's something that
Right.
there's kind of the belief, yeah, kids need a little break from learning before they get back to the serious task of sitting in their seats and learning. The
Hmm.
so the difference is stark, and I don't think it's an accident that the difference is so stark because
Hmm.
schools were really never developed for the purpose that we would like them to serve today, that most people would like them to serve today. Schools were
Yeah.
really the schools that we have today really began, centuries. Really began in the 17th century. It goes really way back.
Mm.
The first kinds of schools that looked like schools today, and they were religious schools, that Protestant religious schools, and the purpose of them was to teach obedience and to indoctrinate children in, at that time, in biblical doctrine. So that's the kind of school you would set up if that's your purpose, to teach
Mm-hmm.
obedience and to indoctrinate children in something that you believe is truth with a capital T. And and then schools got started, and they were ultimately taken over by states, by governments, where now
Mm-hmm.
the goal became not the doctrine of religion, but the doctrine of the state. It was sort of to
Yes.
teach nationalist
Mm-hmm.
beliefs. And then with time, we've sort of expanded our view. We no longer think of schools as to indoctrinate children either in religion or in nationalist beliefs, although we still do a little bit of that.
Mm.
But we have all these other agendas, but we haven't changed the way we do school. We still do it
Right.
in the same way, where,
Mm-hmm.
the teacher tells you information, presents information, and you have to feed it back.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, the only way that you can fail in our standard schools is by not doing what you're told to do. And
Mm-hmm.
the only way you can pass is by, at least most of the time, doing what you're told to do. And
Right.
so it's still the case that the
Mm-hmm.
primary lesson is obedience, obedience to authority.
Mm-hmm.
Do what you're told to do and you will pass. No matter how boring it is, no
Right.
matter whether it's going to last with you or not, no matter whether you
Mm-hmm.
already know it or not, no matter whether it's just a total waste of time for you, you've got to learn to do what you're told to do. And so I, you know, most people who go into teaching today don't think that their purpose in teaching is to teach obedience and indoctrinate children. They talk about, I want children to be curious, I want them to love learning, I want them to be critical thinkers, I want all of this and that. But if that were really the purpose of schools, schools would look nothing like what they look like today. So
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, what happens is teachers come in with young teachers may come in with very ideal ideas of what they want to do, but they're
Yes.
there. They're faced with 30 kids.
Mm-hmm.
The primary thing they have to do is keep order, or they'll get
Right.
fired if they don't keep
Yep.
order.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to make sure the kids pass certain tests. No
Right.
way can they promote curiosity. No way can they allow the kids to
Mm-hmm.
play in their own natural ways. And this is more true today than it was even in the past, because we've become more
Right.
insistent about testing. We've developed a
Mm-hmm.
stronger hierarchical control. It used to be that teachers had more authority in the classroom, and
Right.
they could loosen up and they could do
Mm-hmm.
fun things. And now many of those teachers who used to do that are quitting because they're finding they can't do that anymore. They're
Mm-hmm.
being directed that you've got to spend time preparing these kids for these standardized exams.
Right.
So that's standard education, and that's nothing like the way children naturally learn, and in fact, it suppresses the way children naturally. So what I've been
Mm-hmm.
interested in is, well, what would happen if we didn't do that? If instead of
Right.
that, we let kids learn in their natural ways,
Mm-hmm.
and we adults simply provided the kind of environment and
Yeah.
opportunities that allows children to do that. What would happen if you
Mm-hmm.
did that? Well, it turns
Right.
out that this idea has been around for quite a long time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there are schools that have been operating for many years. Sudbury Valley has been operating for over 50 years, which is where I did my first research
Ah.
with this principle. This is a place for self-directed education where children are
Mm-hmm.
playing and exploring and following their own interests and socializing with one another and
Mm-hmm.
in the process becoming educated. And then, so I did a study many years ago of the graduates of that school. And then there are also this growing number of unschoolers, as you said in the
Yes.
introduction.
Mm-hmm.
So homeschoolers who are saying, well, instead of trying to do school at home, instead of, giving my kids
Exactly.
the same kind of curriculum, which my kids apparently aren't very interested in,
Right.
why don't I let them do what they're interested in? you know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and instead of fighting with them to make them do this other
Yes.
stuff, why don't I go with them and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
this is what you're interested in. If I can
Yeah.
be of any help, let me know.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of what unschooling is. And so,
Mm-hmm.
well, it turns out there are quite a lot of unschoolers in this country. I mean, proportion wise, it's small, but it's
Mm-hmm.
still, I figured out that there's something. Actually, there's a big increase now in homeschoolers and in unschoolers because of COVID. But
Right.
even before COVID, it was something between 3 and 5% of
Yes.
American school children are being homeschooled, and of those, based on government data, I figure that about 20% of those, so it's something like 1%, something roughly around 1%
Mm-hmm.
of children in the United States are being unschooled. That's a
Right.
small percentage, but that's a huge number.
Yeah.
And if you, you know,
Right. And you also talk about it as relaxed homeschooling, which I think
and
some
and
some
there's
people are a
there's
little
all
more
gradients, and
welcoming
there are
to.
a lot of people who are really doing unschooling, but they don't want to call it that.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
That sounds to them like they're being neglectful, or they might think other people are thinking they're being neglectful.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's a range of it. I think the majority of homeschoolers they're not doing, except in maybe a very few cases, they're not doing as much school as the kids would be having if they were going to a typical standard school.
Right.
So no
Mm-hmm.
matter how you're doing homeschooling, there's more unschooling going on. There's
Right.
more
Because kids just
time
have
for
free
children to
time.
do their own
Mm-hmm.
things, to play, to explore, to follow their own interests. And even when you're supposedly doing the curriculum, it's very hard if you're a parent and this is your child to
Mm-hmm.
just override your child's interest. You at least try to sort of focus it around your child's interest
Right.
so that the
Mm-hmm.
child becomes more engaged in it, and the child
Mm-hmm.
wants to do this because you're figuring out some way. All right, we've got to do geography or whatever it is you've got to do because you're thinking you're doing school. So let's at
Right.
least talk about the geography and see if there's some aspect of geography that you might be interested in,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
maybe this is just, maybe you've already got an interest in geography, and maybe it comes from a computer game you're playing, and maybe it's this
Mm-hmm.
or that, but so it can be focused more on the child's own interest. It's definitely more child centered. That's not totally unschooling when the parent is involved that way, but
Right.
it's in the direction of it compared
Mm-hmm.
to at school.
Well, and
So
I
that's the
think
basic
parents
difference. The
that do
basic
that for
difference
just a
is that,
little while too, that
what's that?
they it's like if you dabble in just a little bit, that
Right.
you the water feels more comfortable to then take the next step
I
to
think
to
that's
move
right.
towards that unschooling
That's right. I
type of
did a
attitude.
study along with Gina Riley, is a colleague who's at Hunter College, and I did a study of unschooling families where we surveyed the parents. There were
Mm. Mm-hmm.
323 parents, if I remember right, in that who responded to our survey, mostly moms, of course,
Yes, of course.
and and we asked them, among other things, the trajectory that led them to unschooling.
Mm-hmm.
And relatively few of them started with unschooling.
Yeah.
Some of them started with homeschooling, and then they realized that not only were their kids bored with with the curriculum that they were
Mhm.
trying to teach, but they were bored with it. And so
Right.
it sort of devolved. And then they
Yeah.
learned, well, then so they let the kids do more and more of their own thing. And then they learned, oh,
Mhm.
there's a term for this. It's called unschooling. And then they felt a
Right.
little better about it. We're not
Uh-huh.
just being neglectful here, we're doing
Yeah.
unschooling.
Mhm.
And so that was kind of the one route. Probably even more common was to actually start off, at least with your first child, in a typical school, and that didn't work out.
Mhm.
And so then you take the child out for homeschooling, and that doesn't work out. Then you try unschooling, and lo and behold, the child
Mhm.
is happy. The child's eyes brighten up again. The child seems to be learning.
Yeah.
And then another study that Gina Riley and I did was of the graduate, former, people who grew up
Yes.
unschooled. We identified
Mhm.
75 grown unschoolers and asked them about their experiences when they were being
Mm.
unschooled, asked them about
Mhm.
how they were, did they go on to higher education or not? And
Right.
if they did, how did they get in without having
Mhm.
done any school before, right?
Right.
How did they survive it once they got
Mhm.
in? And for those who didn't go on, why didn't they? Couldn't they? Is it possible? Couldn't you do it, or didn't you want to do it? And if you didn't want to do it, why didn't you want to do it? We
Uh-huh.
asked them about their careers. And what we basically found is that they can go. They don't seem to have any problem going on to higher education if they want to
Mhm.
do it. If they're going into a career that requires it, they go on and they figure
Yep.
out what they
Yep.
have
They
to do to
figure it
get
out.
into the college they want to get
Exactly.
into. They figure it out.
Mhm.
They haven't taken any of the required courses, right? But they say, but in some sense, this is kind of refreshing to the administrator. The at least in some colleges,
Right.
you're looking at all these students that they've all got A's on their
Yeah.
transcripts.
They've been programmed.
They've all done all
Basically.
the things you're supposed to do to get into
Uh-huh.
college, especially if you're at an elite college. And now here's somebody who says, "Oh, I don't have any transcript. I haven't taken any courses. But here's what I've done, and
Mhm.
here's why I want to go to your college." And
Right.
that's kind of interesting. This person is different, and
Mhm.
uh, so if
Well,
the
and a lot of the colleges now are asking for portfolio's.
yeah, they're asking for
And
portfolios, and the unschoolers are very good at portfolios, and they're also
mhm.
generally very good at interviews. And they typically can
Right.
get an interview because
Mhm.
this is one way to get to know them, and if you,
Mhm.
in where you don't have the typical things, and
Mhm.
if it's a school that requires the SAT or the ACT, the kids prepare for it and they do
Right.
fine on it. It doesn't take a heck of a lot of work to prepare for it. They figure out a way to.
Right.
There
They figure
are,
it out.
even kids who are going through the regular school, they take the SAT. They study the SAT prep book, and that's how they learn to do it.
Exactly. Yep.
And and um,
Mhm.
and so these kids do the same thing. And maybe they have to study a little bit of math to bring themselves up to the point where they can do it. But
Mhm.
it doesn't take years and years and hours and tears of doing it.
Right.
You're
And they're
15,
probably
16,
more fresh
17
with all
years
the
old and you want
algorithms
to
than
do
the
it.
rest of them. So
Yeah.
yes.
So that's what we found regarding higher education. What we found regarding careers was interesting
Yeah.
that at least about half of them, I should say, we could see a very direct relationship between what they told us they were doing as a child, what they
Hmm.
were passionate about playing at, and what
Right.
their career was today. So
Mhm.
it's not uncommon in self-directed education, and whether it's at a democratic school like the Sudbury Valley School or whether it's in unschooling,
Mhm.
for children to play at a lot of different things, and they get then at some point, some of them, not everyone, but some of them develop a real passionate interest, and they
Yep.
really focus on that, and they
Mhm.
become good at it.
Mhm.
And some of them actually start making money at it while they're still kids. This is not
Yes.
too uncommon, becoming, I think, even more and more common today with the
Mhm.
internet. And you can be
Yeah.
an entrepreneur, you can start selling your
Mhm.
stuff, you could start,
Right. Yeah.
and they've in some sense then got a head start on their career. And we found
Mhm.
about 50% of that 75, about half of them were in careers that they had passionate interests in
Hmm.
that were direct extensions of what they had done what they had been doing in play as children.
Oh. So they're not the ones that graduate from college and go, I still don't know
And
what I'm
often
good
those
at
are
and what I
not the
want to
ones who
do.
graduate from the college. Most often
Right,
they're not. But
exactly.
some of them are because what they wanted to do requires college
Required
sort
it.
of as a
Yeah.
license. But I'll,
Mm-hmm.
just to give you an example or two. So
Yeah.
one of these young adults, he was about 20 or 21 when we did the study, and he was an assistant movie producer in
Hmm.
Hollywood, assistant to a movie producer in Hollywood. His dream is to become a movie producer. Well,
Hmm.
he's a kid like a lot of kids today who was making YouTubes,
Right. Yep.
and who got good at it. And
Hmm.
and he was attracting an audience.
Hmm.
And he discovered at one point, I believe he was living in Chicago, and he discovered at one point that his major movie was going to be made in his city, and he
Hmm.
volunteered to help.
That's
And so
yeah.
he went out and he helped. He was probably about 16,
Hmm.
and the person he was helping was so impressed with him that they
Hmm.
invited him back to Hollywood at a good salary while he's still a
Wow.
teenager.
Uh-huh.
And so, that's just one example. Take
Hmm.
another example. There was one of the graduates well, he described his interests as a child as he had three interests. One was nature, hiking. He spent as much
Hmm.
time as he could out in the woods hiking.
Uh-huh.
A second interest was photography, and he got really
Hmm.
interested in photography. And by the age of 15, he said he was already selling some photographs.
Wow.
But then also around age 15, he got interested in hang gliding. So,
Oh, wow.
he- and from hang gliding, he got interested in flying fixed wing aircrafts. And
Hmm.
I guess he was making enough money from his photography that he could afford to take lessons.
That's an
And
expensive
now
hobby.
his career is as an aerial nature photographer, combines all
Wow.
three of his interests.
Yeah.
And
That's amazing.
I found his website. It's actually beautiful stuff that he
Hmm.
does. So, those are just two examples. Maybe those are the two most exotic examples, but I could go through many, many other examples where
Right.
kids, jobs that you would never think of. If you had just been
Exactly.
doing school, you'd think, what else is there to do? There's, if I'm aiming for a high status job, I guess I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a lawyer,
Right.
or I want to be.
Yep.
But who would
Hmm.
think of being an aerial nature photographer, right?
Right.
Or
Exactly.
so that's so you have time to
Hmm.
learn what you like to do, and you have
Yes.
time to become good at it. And
Hmm.
it
Exactly.
turns out that knowing what you want to do and being good at it is actually a lot more important as a career qualification than what degree you have. It's not the
Yes.
case that all employers understand that yet, but a growing
Hmm.
number
Hmm.
are learning to understand that.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, and that self-confidence that comes with it. I think, our education system, so especially with kids that struggle, which is what our nonprofit helps parents to teach kids that struggle with the typical academics, all we want to focus is on, and this is what you do bad. And where unschooling just unlocks that this is what you do good and you could do it all day.
Right.
and and work on that. I know my daughter at 16, she just won a design contest. She's been designing and doing drawing, but also fashion, and she designed a pair of shoes that are now being produced in Holland, and they're going to be mass produced.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's something that she wants to go into fashion design, and what an
Great.
awesome thing to add to her portfolio.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
But you just never know unless you give them that time, because they can't
Right.
develop those skills overnight or in between all these classes that
Right.
we
Yeah. I
offer.
mean, in this day and age more so than ever in the past. We're keeping kids so busy between school and homework and all those after school
Mm-hmm.
activities, adult directed after school activities that they tend to be put into. Um, they really don't have time to develop hobbies and figure out what they really love to do.
Yeah.
Interestingly, with COVID,
Mm.
some kids are having time, and so I'm
Yes.
hearing from parents who are discovering that, hey, my kid is not wasting time home from school. My kid has actually gotten
Mm-hmm.
into this and that, and I'm thinking of not sending my kid back to school. I'm seeing
Yes.
things in my child that I didn't realize were there, and
Mm-hmm.
so unfortunately, the COVID prevents them from going out and playing with friends, at least in close distance. But it doesn't. But it gives them the gift of time, and
Mm-hmm.
there were all these dire fears about how children were going to suffer as a result of COVID. So far, the studies that have been done, despite what you read in the paper, the actual
Mm-hmm.
studies that have been done show that all in all, children are doing better
Mm-hmm.
psychologically since
Yeah.
COVID than before, and why it's because their schedule has slowed down. They don't
Right.
have the stress of
Mm-hmm.
school. School is the number one stress for kids.
Yeah.
People don't
Yeah.
recognize that, but
Mm-hmm.
I've published data that shows that, not my own research, but other people's research
Mm-hmm.
that shows that the rate of emotional breakdowns, the rate of psychological the rate of
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, and even of suicide
Mm-hmm.
is much higher during the school year than it is
Yes.
when kids are off from school in the
Mm.
summer. And I know of at least one state's data, preliminary data, showing that the rate of suicide among school-age kids has dropped during the COVID period when they're not in
Wow.
school.
Mm.
Everybody's afraid of all the psychological damage of this, and
Mm.
I don't want to. I don't want to be too rosy about this. I mean, clearly, many people are suffering from COVID, and many kids are too.
Mm-hmm.
And many kids are suffering from being at home in families that don't get along very well with one
Right.
another, and
Yes.
so on and so forth. Absolutely, I don't want to understate that.
Mm-hmm.
But we did a study through the Let Grow organization across social classes, a large-scale study. It's published as one of my blog posts on my Psychology Today blog. Anybody who's interested can look it up. But we surveyed a large number of families, and what we found across race, across social class, across geography, we found that the kids were, and the parents were reporting the kids to be less anxious
Mm-hmm.
and reporting them to do well. And parents were reporting that they were having far less conflicts with their children than they had when the kids were in school.
Yes.
And a lot of people, they hear that, that's surprising to them because they think, well, if your kids are home all day and you're home all day, isn't that going to create conflicts? And I'm sure it does create some conflicts, but I think that most of the conflicts that parents have with kids are about school.
Yeah.
It
Just
has
getting
You
their
got to
schoolwork
get the
done.
kid up in the
Mm-hmm.
morning. Kids are sleep deprived. They're not designed to
Mm-hmm.
get up at 7 in the morning to get ready
No.
for the bus, or 6 in the
Mm-mm.
morning for some kids. They're just not, especially teenagers aren't.
Yeah. No.
So you got to get
We
them
didn't
out of
start school
bed.
until after noon when my kids were teenagers.
You got to get them out of bed. And then when they're home, you got to nag them to do their homework. You've got to make
Mm-hmm.
sure, because you as the parent are held responsible if the kids don't do their homework
Right.
in
Yeah.
today's
It's so
world.
much
You get
pressure.
blamed by the teachers. You get called in. You're sitting in that little seat, and the teacher's scolding you.
Yes.
Not in the same nasty way that they might scold your kid, but they're
Right.
still they're still clearly blaming you for the fact that your kid
They
is
may
not doing
fine
the
you
homework.
too. Exactly.
And so then you've got to, so of course there are conflicts between kids and parents, and a lot of parents were reporting, oh, my child is so well rested, and part of it is that they're just getting enough sleep now. So
Right.
that
Exactly.
was one of the things that we learned in the study. This would be true for homeschooling of any kind too, that
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to go on a certain schedule. You
No.
can
Yes.
the kids can sleep on their own biological rhythm, and they can get enough
Mm-hmm.
sleep that way, and they are better people as a result of that.
Exactly. Oh, that's so true. Yeah, I think what the negative reports we're seeing from the schools is that kids aren't meeting those standardized test standards, and they're all falling behind as this average that
Right,
all the schools achieve for,
right.
which when you're unschooling or you're homeschooling, you don't do
You
that.
don't worry about that, and I think that it would be good if, for those people who do have kids in school, if they could realize this is not really such a big problem. And one of the reasons I know it's not such a big problem is I've seen this over and over and over again.
Mm.
you will find an unschooled kid or a kid going to Sudbury Valley, and at some point they decide for whatever reason that they want to go to a regular school.
Mm-hmm.
And there's often good reasons. They just want to try it out. Their friends are
Yeah.
there. They think they might be missing something. They
Mm-hmm.
want to, they want to go, they want to be in high school and have the prom, and this is part of the cultural thing. So
Right.
they decide
Right.
to go to school. And here they haven't taken any of the previous courses at all. They've never taken a standardized test. And yet
Right.
they go to school and they go right into what grade they would be in, and they do fine. They
Mm-hmm.
catch right up. It's
Right.
not like you're falling. I think there's two reasons that they catch up. One is that the truth of the matter is everybody in school forgets most of that stuff anyway,
Exactly.
right?
You're
I
always
mean,
relearning.
you're just learning it for the test, and so you
Yeah.
forget it. It's not like there's this big accumulation of knowledge over
Mm-hmm.
time, and third grade builds on first grade and on second grade, and then
Right.
it doesn't build that way. And this is also, I'm sure, why I believe why kids can go on to college who haven't taken any courses before. The
Mm.
college professors don't assume that you remember anything from high school. They start,
Exactly. They
they're
start from
teaching
the
at a
beginning.
faster and more sophisticated level and a more
Mm-hmm.
interesting level, perhaps, but they're not assuming that you are coming in with knowledge of the subject
Mm-hmm.
from high school. They're assuming that they've got to start from scratch, and they're also, to be honest, they're arrogant enough to believe that the teachers taught it wrong anyway, and so they're going to teach it the right way from the beginning. So just people just shouldn't worry about it. The other
Exactly.
thing that's of significance. You know how people talk about the summer slide in
Mm-hmm.
between the end of one school year and the beginning of the next school year. There's this idea that children lose a lot of
Yeah.
their academic skills
Mm-hmm.
and then have to relearn it. And this has led some people to argue that we should have school all through the summer
Yep.
so that you don't lose those academic skills. My argument is if that's true, well, you're going to lose it as soon as you leave school anyway. And does this mean we should just keep people in school their whole lives because they're going to lose it? And it must mean it was learned in a pretty shallow way to begin with if you're just going to
Mm.
forget it over the summer. The truth of the matter is, I've actually looked at the data on summer slide. There actually have been some studies. It's not just word of
Oh,
mouth. There's
awesome.
some studies. And what the studies show is overall, there's no summer slide in reading. Reading
Mm.
actually improves over the summer, at least as fast as it improves during the school year. There's a summer slide in arithmetic and math if you are testing it by the standard school methodology of testing. So doing
Mm-hmm.
school math, like
Right.
do you remember how to do long division without a calculator? Can
Mm-hmm.
you, do you remember your timetables? All that kind of
Yep.
stuff that depends on memorizing a method of doing things, memorizing
Mm-hmm.
information. That tends to slide, although it's regained very quickly the next year.
Mm-hmm.
What doesn't slide is mathematical reasoning. And in fact, that
Hmm.
increases during the summer. But I found 3 studies that actually assessed
Wow.
mathematical reasoning, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to solve story problems, the ability to make real world use of
Mm-hmm.
mathematical
Right.
concepts. That actually increases over the summer. I found 3 studies showing that increases at a faster rate than it increases during the school year.
Hmm.
And to me, it's not surprising because when you're not in school, you might be doing real things that involve numbers. You're
Exactly.
you're
Mm-hmm.
cutting recipes in half, helping your mom cook, or you're measuring
Yep.
boards, or you're painting your room and figuring
Mm-hmm.
out how much paint you've got to buy. And
Right.
or,
Exactly.
or you're playing games that involve
Mm-hmm.
numbers, and even computer games. I shouldn't say even
Yep.
computer games, in some sense, especially computer games.
Oh
Some
yeah.
of them involve rather sophisticated math.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to calculate. One unschooling mom told me about her kid who plays this game where he has to calculate compound interest rates in order to figure out how much he's making on his investments in this game. And this is
Mm-hmm.
like a 10-year-old kid,
Right.
and he's got to be able to convert between different currencies
Oh
to know how
wow.
much he's got
Huh.
if he's spending it in this foreign country or
Right.
that foreign country.
Hmm.
So this is math that is real. This is math that is meaningful to him in the
Yeah.
context of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And
exactly.
he's learning these things in a way that he knows what they are, that it's meaningful to him.
Mm-hmm.
So this is mathematical reasoning. And so this is mathematics learned in a context in which you're going to remember it
Exactly.
because it's
Mm-hmm.
meaningful. You know what it's for.
Yeah.
So this is the difference. The difference between one of the differences really between self-directed education, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
unschooling or at a democratic school, and school at school. So when you're
Mm-hmm.
doing school at school, you're learning to pass a test.
Yep.
and
And it does
and
require a
that's
lot of
all you
memorization.
really care about is passing the
Mm-hmm.
test. And you are learning it in a memorized way because you need to feed it back in it
Mm-hmm.
pretty much in the way it was taught to you.
Right.
You're not bothering to think about it. That's just a
Mm-hmm.
waste of time.
Right.
Because if you
Yep.
think about it, you might think about it and give it back to the teacher in a way that's different, and the teacher won't understand that and will mark it wrong. I've
Exactly.
seen that
Yep.
over and over again. That was
Mm-hmm.
that
I
drove
think
my
that
son
frustrates
crazy,
my
even
daughter the
when he was a
most.
kid.
Yep.
So you
Yeah.
learn to be shallow about it. You
Mm-hmm.
learn not to think
Yeah.
about it. But if you're painting your room and you have to figure out how much paint to buy,
Mm-hmm.
well, you better figure out, what square feet really means and how to divide
Right.
the number of square feet that a gallon of paint will cover by that number of square feet. And now
Mm-hmm.
you know what the concept of a square number is. And now you know what
Right.
multiplication is. And now you know what
Mm-hmm.
division is because you've done it in the real world.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it sticks
It
versus,
sticks,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, we have a couple comments, one comment and a question from one of our viewers on YouTube. Um, but because you were talking about sleep, and she said, "My children have grown taller because they're getting more sleep."
I've heard that from others too. I heard
Really?
somebody wrote in and they told me after 2 months of the lockdown that her son had grown 4 inches or something like that. That
Wow.
might be an exaggeration of something like it was some amazing amount. I mean,
Oh.
and here's how I believe it. One of
Mm-hmm.
the things we know about stress is that it actually
Mm.
does inhibit growth. Stress can
Yeah.
produce high levels of cortisol. We know there's actually
Mm-hmm.
studies showing that especially young children are producing stress levels of cortisone when they're going to school.
Right.
And at high enough levels, that can actually inhibit growth. So you can imagine
Mm-hmm.
that the relief from that,
Right. Exactly.
now there's kind of a regenerative spurt of growth. I believe it.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to have systematic data
That
on
would
it,
be
but
that would
I
be an
believe that.
interesting study.
Uh,
Exactly. The other question she had, I don't know if you want to answer it or if you want me to field it, but she asked, "Do unschool kids have to pass a standardized exam every year in the USA?"
No, that's not the case. Now, of course, I have to say that the rules differ from state to state,
Yes, exactly.
but in most
Mm-hmm.
states and in most, and even differs in how the rules are enforced from school district to school district.
Mm-hmm.
But my experience with homeschooling parents is that generally speaking, there's no requirement to take standardized tests.
Yeah.
There's maybe a requirement to report periodically to a school administrator, and usually that report involves some kind of a report that puts into school-like language what your child is doing. And so parents get good at translating what their child is doing into history and geography and
Right.
mathematics and
Mm-hmm.
science, and so in general and there are many school districts that don't really even check up at all. They're
Right.
just
Well,
fine.
and for the states that do require standardized tests, they don't require you turn them in. They are
That's
meant,
interesting.
because like in Minnesota, that's a requirement, although they only say if your child falls below the 30th percentile in any subject that you make a change in how you're teaching them in that subject.
I see. So
But it's very minimal. There are some states like Oregon where you do have to, if your child falls below a certain percentile, you have to develop a plan and submit it to the school district. But it is a state by state thing. So
uh,
yeah. And most states don't require it. But actually, we have a whole blog on our website about state testing requirements,
Oh,
so
good.
you can look
Good.
for
I'm sure
that,
that's
and
helpful.
that'll be helpful. So, as we have parents thinking about this, do you have any ideas for how parents can increase their child's opportunities for free play and encourage free play learning in their homes, because we're all stuck in this school mentality. That's how we were all raised. How do we get beyond that and kind
Right.
of open those doors for learning in our homes?
Right. Yeah, so of course, right now with COVID, it is largely in your homes. If it were
Yeah.
not for
Mm,
COVID, I would be saying, let's not talk about in your homes. Let's talk about outdoors.
exactly. Well, and there is the one exception if you want to develop a homeschool pod with some families that you have an
Yeah,
agreement with a couple families too.
yeah, and people are doing that, and
Mm-hmm.
there are also ways that kids can play while social distancing.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen examples of it, and there are things you can play. I've seen, this in the spring, when schools first closed.
Yeah.
I'm a big bicyclist, and I would go out bicycling, and I never saw kids bicycling before. And suddenly I
Yeah.
began to see lots of
Exactly.
kids bicycling.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in Massachusetts, my state, the bicycle stores all sold out. People were
Really?
selling used bikes at outrageous prices, because everybody wanted to buy. Family, I saw people teaching their kids, parents teaching their kids
That's
to ride bikes.
awesome.
I'd never seen that before
Uh-huh.
around here. So then I began to see kids riding bicycles, social distancing while riding. I also saw, some of the old games that I used to play as a kid with
Mm.
my siblings and friends, like badminton. You don't have to get close to one another to play
Yeah.
badminton in the lawn,
Uh-huh.
And so there are things that I began to see more. I began to see many more kids outdoors than I had
Yeah.
before because they were home from
Mm-hmm.
school and they had free time, and they were bored inside, and they were going out
Mm-hmm.
to play. And so I think that in my mind, the primary requirement for play, the primary resource for play for children is other children.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the resource that in our culture today, not irrespective of COVID, but before
Mm-hmm.
COVID, and it's going to be true, and it's true now, and it's going to be true after COVID, that we are a world in which, for the first time in the history of humanity, children don't have easy and free access to other children to play with away from
Yeah.
adults.
Mm-hmm.
In the history of humanity, children have always spent huge amounts of time playing with other children
Mm-hmm.
away from adults. And that's where much of the most important learning occurs. And the reason it
Right.
occurs is because there's no adults interfering, there's
Mm-hmm.
no adults solving the problems. So the kids have to solve the problems themselves, and they
Yeah.
learn how to solve the problems.
Mm-hmm.
They learn how to initiate their own activity without some adult doing it for them. They learn how to negotiate with their peers so that
Right.
they can play something they all want to play. They learn how to deal with that bully down the street.
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to do about, without some parent solving the problem? They learn how to
Mm-hmm.
deal with the realities of the world. That's how children
Yeah.
learn how to do it. Uh, One of the things that I've often say is that when there's an adult around, children are children. But when there's no adult around, children have to be the adults.
Yes.
Children have to take responsibility. They have to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to do things, and they're pretty good at it.
Yeah.
But they need the
Mm-hmm.
experience of doing it, and that's why they need lots of opportunity to play away from adults. That's why children,
Mm-hmm.
by the age of 4, children want to spend at least some time away from adults with other kids. By the time
Mm-hmm.
that they're 6, 7, 8, and certainly by the time they're teenagers, they want to be away from adults with their friends a lot of the time.
Right.
And
Yep.
we live in a world where we don't give them that opportunity, and we're
Mm.
stunting their social and emotional, and I would add intellectual development
Mm-hmm.
by virtue of not of creating a world in which that doesn't happen. The only
Mm-hmm.
way they can get together with their friends, largely speaking, away from adults is online.
Mm-hmm.
And thank goodness they can at least do that. And now there
Right.
are parents who want to ban them from that, right? So,
Yeah.
you
Yep.
take that away and you've really destroyed children's opportunities to interact with other children away from
Mm-hmm.
adults.
Yeah. Yeah, we put so many limits on it. It was funny that my daughter's friend came over and they were going to take the car and drive across Houston, which is dangerous. And she said, "Well, what time do you want us back?" And I said, "Well, before curfew, that's fine." And she goes, "Well, when's curfew?" And I said, "Well, midnight." And she's like, "Oh, really?" I mean, that was like a new concept to her, because I guess her parents had pretty tight rein on her, and she
Yeah,
was going to stay over at our house. And I said, "No, I trust you."
yeah,
And I know in your book you talk about that trustful parenting.
right.
Can you delve into that just a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, trustful parenting is really recognizing that your child is capable. You
Mm,
know, your child isn't capable of everything, but your child
right.
is capable of a lot more than you might think.
Mm,
And it is trusting your child to have, children have a lot more sense. One way I present this to often to parents is think about yourself as a child.
mm,
And I think most parents, when you think back, what was I like when I was 6 or 7 or
mm-hmm,
10? Or what was I like? What was I thinking? What was I doing? And
mm-hmm,
I think that when you really delve into that, you were pretty sophisticated.
mm-hmm.
You really were. You might have done some stupid things, but you still do stupid things, right?
Exactly.
You weren't all that different then than you are
Right.
now.
Yep.
Some of my research, as you might know, has been looking at how children in hunter-gatherer cultures are treated
Mm-hmm,
and how they live. And I haven't had the opportunity to study a hunter-gatherer culture directly myself, but
mm-hmm,
I've surveyed anthropologists.
mm-hmm,
And what I've learned is that hunter-gatherer cultures, wherever they've studied, they consider children at around the age of 4 to have common sense.
mm,
And when a child has common sense, then adults don't have to watch them all the time. The child is capable of remembering rules. The child is capable of taking pretty good. The child isn't going to go walking off into the jungle and pet a tiger, or
mm-hmm,
pick up a poisonous snake. The child can remember those things, and the child
mm-hmm,
has enough sense not to do something truly dangerous. That's their assumption.
mm,
Now, when I was a kid in Minnesota in the 1950s, by the time, I can't say for sure about 4, but by the time I was 5, I could go anywhere in town.
mm,
I could ride my bicycle anywhere in town. And if I went with my 6-year-old friend who was a bit older and wiser than me, we could go out of town on our bicycle. So,
uh-huh.
so there was that sense that, I wasn't going
Mm,
to do something crazy, and nor is your child. But
mm-hmm,
but you have to start off with the assumption that your child has common sense, that your child is capable of these things.
right.
Another change that's occurred over the years that I've seen, it used to be that, so you recognize that there's dangers out there. You do
Yes.
recognize that there's
Mm-hmm,
dangers. And the way that the parents used to deal with that fact is they would teach the children about dangers and how to deal with them.
mm-hmm,
So here's an example actually from my own experience, which when I was 4 years old, we were living in Minneapolis, Minnesota,
okay.
big city. We were
Mm-hmm,
living in a working class neighborhood on a very busy street, and I remember my grandmother decided, and I would have been 4 years old. I know because we moved out of Minnesota by the time I was 5, out of
mm,
Minneapolis by the time I was 5. So I had to have been 4 years old. I remember my grandmother deciding that it was time that I was old enough to be able to go and do some of the shopping myself. To go and buy,
yeah.
to be honest, what she wanted me to do was to be able to go down and buy cigarettes for her. So this was years ago, right? So,
Right, exactly.
so she taught me how to cross the street. She walked with me down to this candy and cigarette store,
Mm-hmm.
and she showed me how to cross the street. And we walked back, and then she said, "Okay, now you're ready to do it yourself." And she sat,
Wow.
and she said, "And here's the nickel. You can buy a popsicle, and come
Mm-hmm.
back." And she sat and watched me on the stoop as
Mm,
I went and I I waited for the walk light, the green light to cross the street. I was being very careful, just as she
Uh-huh.
taught me to be. And I bought the popsicle and walked back. Now, this was a huge achievement. I felt very proud of it.
Yeah,
And then from then on, I
exactly.
could buy cigarettes for her. So, so I'm not promoting buying cigarettes, but I am
Right.
promoting teaching your children how to cross the street and then
Mm-hmm.
letting them cross the street. There are kids who are 10 years old who aren't allowed to cross. It used to
Mm-hmm.
be that by the time you're 10, you could be a traffic guard who was helping younger children cross the street as they walk to school. Now you're not
Yeah.
allowed to cross this. Not only are not you not a traffic guard, but you're not allowed to cross the street. But you've got to
Yeah.
be driven to school or take a school bus. This is
Mm-hmm.
this is absurd. I mean, we are so underestimating children's abilities. So
Mm-hmm.
trustful parenting is recognizing children are much more capable than we think they are, than our
Yes.
culture thinks they are.
Mm-hmm.
And to trust your child also is giving your child some important messages. It is telling your child, I
Yeah.
believe in you.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in your ability. I believe in your
Right.
morality. I believe
Mm-hmm.
you're going to make mistakes, but we all
Mm-hmm.
make mistakes and you'll learn from
Right.
those mistakes. I believe
Mm-hmm.
you will learn from those mistakes.
Yep.
No, that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we're going to give them loaded guns. That's crazy. The hunter gatherers let the kids play with uh, with bows and arrows and and sharp knives and fire because they're not going to kill themselves with that. But the poison darts are kept way way away from the little kids because
Right.
with that you'll kill yourself. But we don't
Mm-hmm.
make this distinction. We assume if you could get hurt doing something, then we're not going to let you do it. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
there are kids who aren't allowed to use the stove at home or to use a
Mm.
sharp knife to cut their meat there are
Mm-hmm.
truly parents who prevent their child from doing that because they're afraid they might cut themselves. Well, maybe they will cut themselves or maybe they'll burn themselves, but so
Mm-hmm.
what? The body is amazing at healing up,
You
and that's how you
remember,
learn,
and
right?
you learn very quickly when you do
You learn very
that.
quickly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's such a good point, and it does, like you had said, it gives your children the understanding that you believe in them, and I mean, we can say it to our kids, but they truly don't think we do believe in them until we do take that step back and actually show them we believe in them.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you need to be able to do things in order to prove to yourself that you can do them. Whether it's
Mm.
climbing trees or whether it's whether it's riding your bicycle around the block and to your
Mm-hmm.
friend, or whether it's all of these things. Children. That's how children grow up. That's the sort of
Yeah.
meaning that this nonprofit that I'm involved with. Let let go and let them grow. That's
Yeah,
kind
I'm
of
going to put
what
that up
that
there.
means.
It's letgrow.org, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
letgrow.org. That's the whole point of this. Let your kids go. Don't hold on to them all the time. Let them
Mm-hmm.
go and let them grow. They need space to grow. They need space away from you to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so true. And there's a lot of good resources on that website for you to use as a parent to help your kids. And I also wanted to point out your other website for the other nonprofit, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. Um, that's www.self-directed.org. Can you tell us a little bit about what's on that website? What you
Yes,
do?
well, this is an organization that that's really designed to promote self-directed education, including democratic schooling of all sorts, where the kinds of schools and learning centers that are set up
Mm-hmm.
where children are in charge of their own learning. And the staff members are there just to help if they want help.
Right.
Um, and there's a big community of kids. One advantage of a school or a learning center like that is there's a community of kids. So there's kids who can
Mm-hmm.
play with one another, and the staff don't follow them around. The staff don't. So, and also unschoolers very much involved. So there's a resource directory there, a searchable resource directory where You can find organizations you can find groups of unschoolers. You can find
Mm,
schools for self-directed education, learning centers. You can find books and articles about it. So that's one of the values of the organization. The organization also has been involved in forming clusters, helping form clusters of people who are involved with
oh, that's
unschooling.
awesome.
So people who you can learn through ASDE about other people who are doing unschooling in your area
Mm-hmm.
if you're an unschooler,
That's
so that you
great.
can get together with them. That's often
Mm-hmm.
very important, not just for the
Yeah.
kids, but it's also often very important for the parents, because
Mm-hmm.
one of the major difficulties with unschooling is that not very many people understand it. And so you're constantly having to explain it to people. You're
Right.
constantly on the defensive about it. You're
Mm-hmm.
trying to justify it, maybe
Yeah.
even to your own parents
Mm-hmm.
who believe you're
Yes.
ruining their grandchildren, right?
Yes.
Or to your own sisters or brothers, or to the neighbors, or even
Mm-hmm.
the strangers who question what you're doing,
Right.
you know?
Exactly.
And and it's very hard to do something that runs so much against the cultural norm. And
Mm-hmm.
so in order to do that, it's very valuable to be connected with other people who are also doing that, doing what you're doing, and who can share information, who can share ideas, who can it's nice if you've only got little kids, it's nice to know somebody who's already got a grown unschooler who can tell you, yeah, my kids went through that, and now
Yeah.
look, they're doing
Uh-huh.
this and that, and
Mm-hmm.
it's reassuring so you're now part of a community that has a different norm, a different way of talking about kids,
Exactly.
and you're
Yep.
no longer feel like you're such an odd one out, like you're doing this really
Right.
risky, strange, weird thing that everybody's pointing their fingers at you. At least now there's
Mm-hmm.
some people who are with you on this,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
and that's very helpful. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um,
Just need
yeah,
that encouragement. So true. Yeah. And then your book, Free to Learn, can be found on Amazon. And I do
yes,
highly recommend that. A lot of what Peter has talked about tonight is in there, plus even more to expand on that, because of course 1 hour doesn't give us even close enough time. And then you have a blog also on Psychology Today called Freedom to Learn
right.
blog. So if you just go to Psychology Today and search for that, otherwise the URL is up on the screen if you're watching the video. So, yeah, and I saw that you have some blogs with COVID related topics, and then some.
Yeah, that study that I mentioned that we did it through the Let Grow group on that's large survey. We actually did it twice,
Wow.
and the results of that I have two blog posts, relatively recent blog posts that describe the results of that for people who are interested. Um, but there's something like 180 posts there, essays there by now that deal with all
Awesome.
kinds of issues regarding play and
Mm-hmm.
regarding trustful parenting and ways of uh, ways of finding ways for kids to get together in today's world and really
Mm-hmm.
play with other kids. How can that be done in today's world? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
essays on that. So
So that's good because and parents have enough things to worry about that sometimes it's nice just to have an expert tell you, how do I do this exactly? And sometimes the nitty gritty day in and day out is what they want to know. So, well, I just want to thank you, Peter. This has been so insightful, and thank our viewers for joining us as well. Thank for those of you that shared some comments and questions. I know there was one comment from one of our Facebook viewers. She goes, "Let go and let them grow." So, yeah, I hope that's a big takeaway from our hour here. And I just want to thank you again, Peter, for your time just to share with us. And I hope it's encouraged many and maybe caused them to take their toes and just leap off a little bit into the less traditional homeschooling mode, or maybe even if their kids are in the virtual learning world right now, that this might be something that's much needed for them. So,
Okay, well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, and I want to let all of you know that this is just the beginning of this month on teaching methodologies. So next week we are actually going to talk about what are we going to talk about? The Charlotte Mason method with Sonia Schaefer. And so we'll be back again next Tuesday night, same time, 8 o'clock Central, to talk about that methodology as we continue this theme through the month. And also, we just want to thank you for our viewers and the sponsors of SPED Homeschool for providing funds to make this broadcast happen. If you'd like to donate to SPED Homeschool, you can go to our website at spedhomeschool.com and click on donate to continue supporting our efforts. But we just want to thank you for joining us for this hour, and we'll see you all again next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.